All right, good morning, everyone. My name is Jeffrey Schott. I'm a senior fellow here at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. I'd like to welcome you this morning for a very important conference that we're holding. We're delighted to host this morning the Washington release of an important new book that has been co-published by the International Labor Organization and the World Trade Organization, entitled Making Globalization Socially Sustainable. And we have today with us senior officials from the ILO and the WTO, the editors of the volume, and several of the authors of important chapters in the book who will make presentations throughout the day. It's when Jose Manuel Salazar came to us and asked if we would be interested in working with them on the Washington release of this book, it immediately struck me that this fit very well with a long-running series of studies and meetings that the Institute has held on globalization and its benefits and costs, and how to better make globalization socially sustainable. And so when I saw the title of this volume, I said, this fits very well with what we have done. We've done numerous studies on globalization. My colleague Gary Huffbauer assessed several years ago the impact of globalization on the U.S. economy and found, as you've heard from this podium, I'm sure, numerous times, that the U.S. economy is about $1 trillion larger than it otherwise would be because of the benefits of global integration, because of globalization. But these benefits, obviously, are, while they make our economy overall richer, are not distributed equally among different segments of the economy. And so we've had numerous studies over the years to say, you know, what is the impact both on the economy and on the labor force of these trends in accelerating globalization in the world economy. Danny Roderick kicked off the debate almost 15 years ago with his very controversial and insightful study, Has Globalization Gone Too Far? And Robert Lawrence answered several years later with an equally interesting and insightful study that said, Has globalization gone far enough? Kim Elliott, who's here, has talked about labor standards in globalization. And we've had a number of other books that have looked at the benefits and distributional consequences of globalization for the U.S. and other economies. So it is really an interesting and apt inclusion of discussion of this important book at this institute. The timing is also wonderful for this meeting. Just yesterday, President Obama sent up to Congress the free trade agreements with Colombia, Panama, and Korea, after only a short delay of 4.5 to 5 years, depending on whether you're Colombian or Korean. But part of the most recent delay was caused by the political jostling over whether parallel legislation on trade adjustment assistance would go forward, which in the eyes of the White House and many others will help make these trade agreements socially sustainable. So these are types of issues that I hope we will get into today in the discussions. Before we start on the book itself, it's my great pleasure to introduce my old friend, Jose Manuel Salazar. Jose Manuel is the executive director of the employment sector of the International Labor Organization. He's been there for now 6 years and living in Geneva. But I knew him first when he was one of the bright young stars of the economy of Costa Rica, leading one of their important business organizations, and then plucked literally at the start of a conference that he was organizing on regional integration to become Minister of Trade of his country, where he was very instrumental in the launch of the negotiations of the free trade area of the Americas. He has had a very distinguished career in economics. He has a PhD in economics from the University of Cambridge. And it's my pleasure to introduce José Manuel Salazar.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much, Jeff, for your kind words, kind introduction. Thank you very much to the Institute, to you, to Fred, for hosting this event. As you said, this fits very, very well with the long tradition of research that you have and contributions at this Institute. And thank you for your hosting and organizing, help us organize. And thank you, everybody, for being here. I must say that personally, it is a great pleasure for me to once again be here at the Institute. I spent 7 years in Washington working on the free trade area of the Americas. Actually, until 2005, I had the patience, even though we knew by 2002-03 that the project was not quite in the right track. But you know, I held on to it until 2005, which was the original deadline, and then this opportunity in the ILO opened up, and I've been there, as you said, in the last 6 years. So it gives me tremendous pleasure to be back here at the Institute, where I came so many times for so many events and where I learned so much. It is particularly satisfying then to be here also to present formally to the Washington community the most recent product of the collaboration between the International Labor Organization and the World Trade Organization, which is this book on making globalization socially sustainable. My special appreciation to the co-editors, Marc Bacchetta of the WTO and Marion Jansen. You will hear from them in a moment. They have done a great job and in organizing the project and thinking about the authors and putting together a fantastic group of contributors. To the authors, of course, all of them very distinguished academics. We have 3 of them with us today: Margaret Macmillan, John Haltingwanger, and William Milberg. Unfortunately, David Blanchflower had to cancel his trip the last minute, so he will not be with us. And of course, our appreciation goes also, very specially, to the International Chamber of Commerce Research Foundation, represented today by Mr. Rob Mulligan, for funding this important research project. Thank you very much. You will hear from him also in a few minutes. This book was launched in Geneva 2 weeks ago, jointly by Mr. Pascal Lamy and Mr. Juan Somavia, and was very well received in that event. In addition to being the third product of a well-established collaboration with the WTO, we have 2 previous books in the last 3 years. It is also one among a series of outputs generated by the Trade and Employment Program. This is a program that I created some 3-4 years ago, precisely to put together the very important trade discussion and the very important labor market discussion. When I arrived to the ILO, I saw that there's a lot of extremely useful material and policy advice and research on labor markets, but we were not quite connecting it with the trade community, particularly at the research level. So we created this program, and the 2 books that you have with you are 2 of the products. There have been other outputs as well. A monograph on the employment effects of trade during the Great Recession was published last year. And this week we're also releasing, and now you have with you this other publication entitled Trade and Employment from Myths to Facts, financed by the European Commission. So even though formally we are presenting 1 book, but you are having 2 for the price of 1, if you like. The social dimensions of globalization have been high on the ILO's agenda for many years now. As you probably know, in 2002, the Director General established the World Commission on the Social Dimensions of Globalization, and this produced a report in 2004 entitled A Fair Globalization, Creating Opportunities for All. Policies and action needed also to overcome globalization's imbalances are regularly discussed in the ILO in several instances, but one of the main ones is the Working Party on the Social Dimensions of Globalization that meets every March and November, and then governments, employees, and workers discuss different aspects and discuss different papers on the subject. Within this context, the reasons for creating a specific research program on trade and employment was, of course, the need for very solid research in this area, but also the fact that while the linkages between trade and jobs are central to both the trade policy debate and the employment policy debate, we notice and we know that the two research and policy communities in the past have not been talking to each other enough. And I think one of the advantages of these two books, and of course now things have changed, is a much closer collaboration and dialogue between the trade community and the labor market community on the economics of labor markets and how they relate to trade and trade regime changes and trade policy changes. A simple click in the USTR website illustrates how important the link is. On the main page, you will find a reference to ongoing bilateral trade negotiations. The relevant sections refers in its title to Jobs for America's Working Families. On the same page, you can also find a reference, for instance, to a complaint recently filed by the United States against China at the WTO. The relevant reference is accompanied by the title, United States Files WTO Case Against China to Protect American Jobs. The opportunities and risks for American jobs related to trade agreements are, of course, very prominently illustrated on this website. And Jeff, of course, mentioned how, again, and has been, I think, the case in previous consideration of trade agreements, there is side-by-side a discussion about trade adjustment assistance. So trade creates both opportunities and costs for workers. As a former trade minister, of course, I firmly believe in the importance of the opportunities. And actually, my own country, I think, is an example of a country that has capitalized tremendously on globalization. But it's not just a story of freer trade. It's a long story, and there's a lot of investment previously in education, skills, in infrastructure, in all sorts of, complementary agendas that came decades before, the opening up. But the cost and the risk for working families are very real and cannot be ignored. The title of this book, Making Globalization Socially Sustainable, has been chosen precisely to signal that globalization may not be sustainable if its social implications are not appropriately taken into account. Indeed, globalization may not be supported by voters if those voters do not find jobs, if their jobs are badly paid or unstable, and if they think those negative experiences of globalization are associated precisely with globalization and freer trade. Surveyed evidence in economies like the United States or the European Union has repeatedly shown that voters do relate negative labor market experiences to trade, offshoring, or other aspects of globalization. Policymakers who believe in the benefits of freer trade and globalization need to ensure that those negative perceptions of globalization change. Now the question is, are these just wrong perceptions, misperceptions, that can be addressed just by improving the flow of information, or are the real effects real, so to speak, and the perceptions are accurate? If the perceptions are based on real problems, then the policymakers will need to address those problems. And this is where I think the book makes a very important contribution. It is organized around three main themes: globalization and employment, globalization and job-related insecurity or uncertainty, and globalization and inequality, in an effort to distinguish three interrelated but, after all, separable dimensions in the analysis. All three themes are at the heart of the daily concerns of many working families around the globe. In this book, those concerns are addressed in a scholarly manner by leading academic experts in their field, and I'm very pleased then that we have three of them with us today to present the chapters that they have contributed to the publication. So I, like you, look forward to their presentations and to the discussion. Thank you very, very much.
Before we start with the overview presentation by the editors, I'd like to just give the podium for a few moments to Rob Mulligan, who is representing the International Chamber of Commerce Foundation, who helped fund this important project. Rob is the Senior Vice President and Head of the Washington Office of the U.S. Council for International Business. He was formerly with Tech America, the largest U.S. high-tech trade association, where he served for 6 years as Senior Vice President International. He also worked for 7 years at the Chubb Corporation. He has an MBA from Solvay Business School at the Université Libre de Bruxelles, a law degree from Ohio State University, and a BA in history from Miami University. You have to show your bona fides to come up to this podium here, Rob, and we welcome you to say a few words. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Jeff. That's probably a good point, that I needed to make sure people knew who I was when I got up here. So, but let me also just mention that, as Jeff said, I'm in the Washington office, head of the Washington office for the U.S. Council for International Business, which was founded in 1945 and represents over 300 U.S. multinational companies, law firms, and trade associations on a broad range of policy issues with the objective of promoting an open system of world trade, finance, and investment. And the reason that I am here today is because USCIB is the United States affiliate organization to the International Chamber of Commerce, and they've asked me to represent them in Washington at this event for the ICC Research Foundation. I would just also note that USCIB is the U.S. industry affiliate to the International Organization of Employers, which represents the business views at the International Labor Organization. The ICC Research Foundation is very pleased to have supported this research project, contributing to a better understanding of making globalization socially sustainable. The Research Foundation provided the funds for this project, while the WTO and ILO contributed the expertise and time of their research departments, and particularly led by project leaders Marc Bacchetta and Marion Jansen. ICCRF was created in 2009 to fund independent research that contributes to public knowledge and debate with the goal of improving economic conditions around the world. It also aims to promote a deeper understanding by policymakers, the media, and the public of the benefits of global trade and investment. And I think you've already heard a little bit of what is going to be discussed today. We think it makes the authors identify many of the benefits of globalization while also demonstrating how it can expose and magnify problems that already exist, such as weak governance, low productivity, and non-competitive economies. The ICC looks to make use of some of the elements from this report in its work of making recommendations to the G20 leaders in November in Cannes. It will help to ICC to formulate recommendations on economic growth, job creation, and trade. The fragile economic recovery has shown how integrated global economy is. The business has an important contribution to make to this recovery in terms of job creation, but will need help from global leaders to boost confidence in the business community. I appreciate this chance to speak today on behalf of the ICC Research Foundation and look forward to hearing from our speakers. Thank you.
Well, it's time now to get to work and to learn about this book. And to do this in more detail, it's my pleasure to introduce the two editors of the volume, Marc Bacchetta and Marion Jansen. And they will make a presentation, overview presentation on the book, and then have a brief discussion before we go into the individual chapters. Marc is a counselor in the Economics Research and Statistics Division of the WTO. He's been there for 15 years, and during that time he also was on leave for a few years to work on trade issues at the World Bank. He holds a PhD from the University of Geneva. Marion is the coordinator of the Trade and Employment Program of the ILO, and she has also been a counselor at the WTO's Economic Research and Statistics Division, as well as an economist in Maxwell Stamp PLC in the late 1990s. And she has a PhD in economics from the Universidad Pompeu Fabra in Barcelona. So without further ado, I will turn the podium over to Marc and Marion for their presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff, for this introduction. Thank you all for being here today for the presentation on this book. The title has been mentioned several times, Making Globalization Socially Sustainable, but let me pause once more to say something about what we had in mind when this title was chosen. Because social sustainability of globalization, social sustainability, that's one of those buzzwords that can mean 1,000 things and can also mean nothing at all. So what did we have in our mind? As José Manuel Salazar already mentioned, we think of sustainability of globalization as something that depends on voters' perceptions of globalization. If voters think the effects of globalization are positive, they will support it, and they will support further trade agreements, for instance. Social sustainability then refers to the perceptions of the social impacts of globalization. And if population believes those impacts are positive, globalization will be supported. So we are interested in this book in the perceptions of the population about globalization and about the social effects of globalization and in how those perceptions are related to realities. Now let's have a look at what public perceptions are like. Here we have a number of numbers from the United States, also from Europe. And these numbers show survey findings conducted in those countries. Now in one survey, for instance, about half of the Americans and Europeans surveyed said that they do think that freer trade results in more job loss than job creation. In another survey, 62% of respondents said that job security has declined, and they linked this decline to globalization. In another survey conducted in Europe, of the 43 countries surveyed, in all of them, the majority of people believe that globalization is an opportunity for economic growth, but that it does increase social inequalities at the same time. So there seems to be a lot of concern about the social implications of globalizations, and at least in the perceptions of the public. And it's the perceptions that will be important for voters' behavior when it comes to them expressing their opinion about trade agreements. Now, what we wanted to do with this book, therefore, is to look at how do these perceptions relate to actual evidence. Do the perception reflect what is going on, or do they not reflect what is going on? And we structured the book around these three issues, these three themes that were already reflected in the survey evidence that I mentioned before, and that we do believe that are a central part for a central characteristic of what makes people determine whether they think globalization is good for them or not. We are looking at what the effect of globalization is on employment and jobs, what the effect of globalization is on uncertainty of the stability of those jobs, and what the effect of globalization is on inequality, on how the gains from globalization are distributed. And then once we have found to which extent those perceptions correspond or not to what is actually going on, we also try with this book to give some guidance for policymakers on what kind of policies can help to address these issues that we see in the perceptions, because the perceptions need to be addressed to get further support for trade liberalization. According to these three themes, we did structure the book around these three topics: globalization and employment, globalization and uncertainty, and globalization and distribution. And on each topic, for each topic, we commissioned 3 chapters. So there are 9 chapters in this book. And I'll give you here an idea of what the first section looks like. Now, one thing that is unique about this book within the context of the ILO-WTO collaboration is that it's the first time that the book was not entirely written by ILO and WTO staff. This time we outsourced the chapters. The chapters have been written by academics, by external people, and we were very lucky that we got a great team of academics together for this particular book. For us as staff of international organizations, it was slightly risky to do this because we don't know what those academics are going to write in advance, and we cannot tell them what to write. We are very pleased with the outcome of the book, and I hope you will be too when you read it. So here, let's look at the first section. Section on globalization and employment. We have 3 chapters there. One that focuses on industrialized countries. And the focus there is on offshoring, which is an issue that is very much in the news currently in areas like the US or the European Union. What is the effect of offshoring on jobs? That chapter has been written by Holger Gerg from Kiel University. Chapter 2 instead focuses on developing and emerging economies, and it's titled Trade, Employment Structure and Structural Transformation. It has been authored by Margaret Macmillan and Danny Roderick, and we're very pleased to have Maggie with us today, and she will tell more about her chapter. The last chapter in that section has been written by David Bell and Danny Blanchflower, and it's titled The Crisis, Policy Reactions and Jobs. When we commissioned the chapter, we thought by the time the book will come out, nobody will be interested in that chapter because the crisis will be over. But fortunately or unfortunately for us, that's not the case. Let me give a bit more detail about each of these chapters. I have 1 slide for each chapter. Of course, I'm not going to do justice at all to any of the chapters, but it gives you an idea of what is in the chapters. So, globalization, offshoring, and jobs. We asked Holger to write about how trade opening and in particular offshoring affects employment in industrialized, in developed economies. And we asked him whether there is a role for governments in helping to maximize the gains from globalization. Holger provides a very neat and very ambitious literature overview of this topic, and he finds that there is evidence that offshoring leads to higher job turnover in the short run, with possibly therefore higher unemployment in the short run, but there are no indications that there is a long-run effect, negative effect on aggregate unemployment. It may happen so that in rich countries, low-skilled workers suffer disproportionately in the sense that the share of unemployment goes up for them. He also finds that structural change towards services, so it's also sometimes referred to as deindustrialization, so move from industry shrinking, services sectors growing, that this can be linked to globalization. And in the policy part, he describes that yes, it would probably make sense to do something for those being hit harder by globalization, by offshoring, in particular low-skilled workers, but that it will be very difficult to identify those who lose and to define how they can be compensated. So yes, there is a role for government, but the design of appropriate policies is not straightforward. 1 slide also for Maggie's chapter, just to give you a taste. She will tell you much more about the chapter. Here I we chose only a chart to present for the chapter because I think this chart tells more than many words. In this chart, they show how what drives growth in different countries. You see 4 bars here. The first one reflects Latin American and Caribbean countries, the second one African countries, the third one Asia, and the last one high-income countries. And you see 2 colors in each bar. There's a blue color. The blue color reflects that growth is driven by productivity increase in sectors or in companies. And you see that there have been productivity increases in all the regions, in all 4 regions, and quite significant productivity increases during the period they are analyzing. I think it's 1990 to 2005, but Maggie will correct me later on if that's wrong. Now, the interesting part, what they focus on what Danny and Maggie focus on in their chapter is the red part. That shows to which extent structural change contributes to growth. Where structural change means that workers move either into more productive sectors and out of less productive sectors, or they move out of the high productive sectors and into the low productivity sectors. And what we see here, that in Latin America and the Caribbean and in Africa, structural change has had a negative contribution to growth. Yes, there have been sectors that have become more productive, but those sectors have not created jobs. They have shed jobs and people moved into low productivity sectors, often in the informal economy. Asia is the region that has been successful in having the highest productivity growth within companies and in making the most productive sectors growth. Workers have shifted into the good jobs, into the high productivity jobs. So structural change has fulfilled what they call the promises of globalization in Asia, but not in Latin America or in Africa. Maggie will tell more about this when she gives a presentation. The last chapter in this section, the chapter on the crisis policy reactions and jobs. We asked David Bell and David Blanchflower to write about how the Great Recession has affected employment and how governments reacted. They discussed that during the recessions, the labour market performance has been weaker in developed than in developing economies. They show that the young, the poorly educated and ethnic minorities have suffered disproportionately in terms of unemployment in developed economies. And they do emphasize that in particular the increases in youth employment can have very negative long-term effects in those economies, because if something goes wrong in your professional career very early on, you may never be able to make up for those losses or for those bad years early on in your professional career. They also show that public sector intervention has often had an attenuating effect on employment impacts during the crisis. But even though the effect has been attenuating, the recovery so far has been jobless. Not many jobs have been created. And they do warn that if recovery remains jobless, that demands for protectionism may grow, in particular in countries where inequalities are widening. Marc will now present the content of the second and the third section to you.
All right. Okay. So the second, as Marion already mentioned, the second section of the book actually explores the linkage between globalization and uncertainty. The public surveys she discussed at the beginning of her presentation suggest that there's a strong perception in the public that globalization reduces job security and more generally increases economic insecurity. The three chapters in this section examine what we know about the effects of globalization on actual and perceived economic insecurity. Chapter 4 by John Haltivanger, who's going to say more about his chapter in a minute, from the University of Maryland, discusses the effect of globalization on economic volatility. Chapter 5 by William Milberg and Deborah Winkler, who again, William is here, so again, there will be more on this later on. Both from the New School of Social Research in New York, focuses on actual and perceived effects of offshoring on economic insecurity and how these effects depend on labor market regimes. Chapter 6 by Devashish Mitra from Syracuse University and Priya Ranjan from the University of California looks at whether and how social protection can help those who are vulnerable to shocks. I'll now summarize the main findings in each of those three chapters, trying to keep it short, certainly on the ones that we will discuss in more detail in a minute. John Haltivanger analyzes how firms and businesses. Sorry, where's the? Sorry. Okay. John Haltivanger actually analyzes how firms and businesses react to the changes in economic conditions brought about by globalization and how this affects workers. He finds evidence that in open economies, less productive firms are more likely to close down and more productive firms to thrive. This actually contributes positively to productivity growth and possibly to workers' earnings and employment. However, he also finds that many things can derail this process. During periods of economic crisis or in distorted economic environments, for instance, in some of the emerging economies, decoupling can take place. Less productive businesses may close down without much new creation or expansion of more productive businesses taking place. Milberg and Winkler discussed the question whether globalization increases labor market related uncertainty or only the perception of uncertainty. They focus on the evolution of the share of income that goes to labor. That's the statistic they think sort of incorporates all the information that they need to have. That's both employment and actually wages. They first observed that in many industrialized countries, the labor share increased in the 70s, began to level off in the 80s, and started to decrease by the end of the 90s. They find that offshoring contributed to this evolution and that its effect on the labor share depends crucially on labor market institutions. Offshoring seems to have raised the labor share in countries with strong labor market support. Mitra and Ranjan ask whether and how social protection can help ensure that no one loses from trade opening. Their review of the literature suggests that social protection can lead to increased support for more open trade. One of the questions we were asking sort of at the beginning when we started with this book. Regarding the design of social protection programs, they find that the focus on trade displaced workers alone may not be enough and that equity concerns may need to be taken into account. They also review social protection measures used to deal with the East Asian crisis and more generally those used in developed and developing countries. One of their findings is that in low-income countries in which social protection systems with wide coverage are not yet in place, public works programs can be very successful in mitigating the consequences of economic crisis. The third section of the book discusses the effects of globalization on distribution and inequality. Many countries have experienced important increases in inequality in recent years. The evolution of incomes in the top percentiles of the income distribution has received considerable attention in the public debate, and globalization has often been pinpointed as one of the possible causes of diverging revenues. Chapter 7 by Nina Pavchnik from Dartmouth College discusses the effects of globalization on within-country inequality. Chapter 8 by Carlis Boyks from Princeton University asks whether and how governments can redistribute income in a globalized world. And finally, Chapter 9 by Ludger Wössmann from the University of Munich focuses on the role of education in making globalization more inclusive. Again, let me briefly summarize the main findings of each of those chapters. Nina Pavchnik first looks at new evidence on the share of the 1%. The top 1% income share. And she actually has this broad panel that has been put together by Atkinson, and which provides evidence on long-term trends in at least 50 countries. And she starts with a discussion of the evolution of inequality, and finds that inequality has actually increased in quite a number of countries since from starting in the 80s. She asks whether globalization is responsible for the growing inequality which has been observed within countries. And her review of the recent literature points at two mechanisms through which globalization can contribute to growing wage inequality between skilled and unskilled workers. First, she points at the fact that offshoring can contribute directly to skills-based technological change in developing countries. That's one of the mechanisms that has been identified relatively recently. And second, trade can contribute to wage inequality by raising wages in exporting firms. Again, that's another of those effects that has been identified relatively recently thanks to development in trade theory, and particularly the whole discussion on heterogeneous firms models. Overall, she finds that the effect of international trade on wage inequality are rather nuanced. They depend on the specific country, the nature of trade liberalization, and or the type of trade that countries engage in. Carlos Boix asks whether globalization reduces the capacity of national governments to pursue economic policies, and in particular redistribution policies. He notes that the observed positive correlation between the size of the public sector and the level of trade openness in OECD countries, but also in some emerging economies, suggests that states can and do develop fiscal policies to compensate those made worse off by globalization. He also finds that this correlation may decline because globalization increases the mobility of labor and capital, but that policies of social compensation, by reducing social conflict, may reduce the incentives of capital to move. Boyce finally finds that dislocation of capital may be avoided by channeling increased public spending into infrastructure, education and training, or the quality of public institutions. Overall, his conclusion is that openness and welfare states are compatible with each other, provided that liberal political institutions spread hand in hand with economic development. In the last chapter, finally, Vossman examines how education and skills policies can be used to spread the benefits of globalization and make it more inclusive. Education and skill policies play a crucial role because they determine whether people are able to share in the gains from globalization. The quality of early childhood education is particularly relevant in this context because it fosters learning at subsequent stages in life. To increase workers' capacity to adapt to changing environments, Vossman argues in favor of putting a strong emphasis on generalizable skills in programs of vocational and technical education where those exist. Overall, the book identifies three challenges that need to be overcome in order to capture globalization's full potential to stimulate productivity and growth. The first one is that the effects of globalization on the structure and levels of employment can be more or less favorable to the labor force. The second one is that openness provides a buffer against domestic shocks, but increases labor markets' vulnerability to external shocks. And the third one is that gains from globalization are not distributed equally. Some firms and workers may lose in the short and possibly medium run. At the same time, however, the contributions in the book suggest that governments have an important role to play in making globalization socially sustainable. First, by investing in public goods, for instance, in infrastructure, in the legal system. Second, by strengthening the functioning of markets relevant for transition processes, and that would be, for instance, the financial markets. Third, by using social protection to facilitate the transition processes and assist those suffering from increased openness. There's a discussion of this in several papers. And fourth, by adopting appropriate education and skill development policies. That's in particular the last paper. So this gives you an overview of the volume, of the contributions in the volume. Obviously, as Marion pointed out, we certainly do not render justice to any of the papers, but we are lucky enough to have three of the authors here. So, after having answered maybe some of the questions you might have to me and Marion, we'll be happy to have presentations by the authors themselves and to discuss in more details at least three of those papers. But for the time being, I don't know how we want to organize this, but I'll probably return to my place.
Well, actually, Marc, you did introduce the next step, and that is we've budgeted time throughout this conference today for questions, comments, and discussion with the participants. So we have not budgeted time for coffee breaks. But coffee is available in the back around the hall. So please feel free to get up quietly and refill your cups if desired. But we have a few minutes to entertain questions or comments on the overall scope of the book or clarifications of the objectives and some of the analysis that Marion and Marc can provide. So the floor is open for any questions. Please go up to the microphone in the back or raise your hand and a microphone will be brought to you. Ernie Prieg.
Thank you. Ernie Prieg, the Manufacturers Alliance, and my question is about the manufacturing sector, as you might. But my question has to do with Ms. Jansen's presentation, or a summary of the conclusions of the first chapter by Professor Georg, who's not here today. In particular, it says there's no indication of longer run effect on aggregate unemployment. However, from the U.S. manufacturing sector, certainly globalization the last 10 years has been huge. It's been more than doubling of exports and imports. But at the same time, our trade deficit in manufacturing has gone way, way up. It's been $400 to $500 billion a year in the last 6 or 7 years. That's equal to 1/3 of our total manufacturing sector in terms of value added. Last year it went up by 70 billion more. That's about 500,000 more jobs net loss. This year will be up another 60 million. So from the U.S. point of view, several million jobs during this period of rapid globalization of the last decade. And to me, to say that there's no indication of a longer run effect, it's been a pretty long run, as far as I can see. So I wondered whether you could clarify what Professor Georg had in mind, particularly vis-a-vis the U.S. on this conclusion.
Why don't I have Marion and Marc, why don't you come up here?
So this finding was about it's about unemployment effect on long-run unemployment figures, and I don't think this finding is in contradiction necessarily with what you say. What one would hope that those jobs lost in manufacturing would be transformed into jobs somewhere else. And what has probably happened in a country like the US is that many people moved into the services sector. Maggie has actually written another paper looking at this issue. And I mean to remember, but correct me, Maggie, if I'm wrong, that indeed people move into the services sector may not necessarily move into better paid jobs, maybe rather the opposite. But they do not necessarily stay unemployed. So this loss in jobs in manufacturing, which is reflected also in Holger Görg's finding that there is deindustrialization and a move towards services. This is indeed going on in many industrialized countries. But as long as people find jobs elsewhere, it doesn't necessarily lead to unemployment increases.
Other questions or comments? Yes, Mike. And please identify yourself.
Michael Finger. I noticed, particularly from the last slide, that the structure of the book is to indicate that the economics of globalization may turn out positive or negative. The whole thing depends on, the choice between positive or negative depends on what government does. My question is, does the book look in any way on how this divide between positive or negative might be related to how business behaves, how labor behaves, how the social sector behaves? That is there anything for anyone in the society to do that's positive other than to yell at government to do something?
No, I'm afraid we focused on the government. No, but maybe we should clarify one thing. That the book focuses on labor market effects of globalization. So it doesn't focus on growth effects. Those effects on the economic effects in terms of growth. Those effects do exist, but they are not discussed an awful lot in the book because that was not the purpose of the book. So that part if you want to have an overall impression of what globalization does to an economy, that part is slightly missing. We did focus on policy guidance for governments, which probably reflects that we represent governmental organizations. So it does look at the social sector, yes, but in terms of how social protection systems need to be designed in order for the economy to react positively to globalization and at the same time protect those workers who lose. So yes, look at social actors, but in terms of policy, governmental actors, not private sector.
Maybe just to have a minor point on this. I mean, I think there are no sort of direct discussion or conclusions on this, but there's all sorts of conclusions that you can draw indirectly from what the various authors say. For instance, on education, obviously, yes, the government has to provide education, but then people have to educate their kids. And so I don't know if this is a sort of... there are all sorts of things the people can do, or workers, or firms, but it's not sort of directly discussed. It can be some inferences can be drawn indirectly from what's said in the book. But I don't know if it answers your question. Probably not.
I think we'll probably get more of the same from Claude Barfield.
This is a question just about the Claude Barfield with AEI. This is a book on globalization, so maybe I'm asking you for another book or how much you looked over your shoulder. A lot of this has to do with external factors that impinge on an economy, whether it's a large economy like the United States or a small economy.
Can't hear you.
But does your analysis give any sense of the relative importance? That is, there are things that are happening in terms of productivity or change in sectoral employment in the United States that are not necessarily totally related or even greatly related to globalization. That would be true with other countries too, I would assume. Is there any sense of comparing the impact of globalization versus the impact of factors that are internal, endogenous to an economy?
Yeah, so most of those, in many of those chapters, there's empirical analysis is conducted, and this work normally takes into account other factors. So if we put on here in the summary statements like globalization has this effect, that means that this is the effect after other factors that may have similar effects have been taken into account. So most of those chapters either contain new econometric analysis or they give summaries of econometric analysis, but it is other issues are taken into account. For instance, one of the reasons why sometimes we don't find the kind of job miracles in high productivity sectors is that those sectors are so productive that they produce, they export, they make profits, they contribute greatly to growth, but they do not need to create jobs to do this. That's one of the things that turns out to be going on in many countries, even in the developing world. Well, so you have productivity increase going on at the same time as trade, and the result is that trade creates growth, but not necessarily jobs.
So one might be able to get a sense of the degree to which, let's say, inequality is growing in the United States because of globalization versus something that is happening internally in the United States, or that the other thing, economic insecurity is growing and it's caused by both internal factors versus external, in some sense of which is the more important?
Yes, sure. The chapter by Nina Pavchnik surveys the evidence, and the evidence is about trying to disentangle the effects of a number of things. And whereas the discussion for a long time has been sort of technical progress as opposed to trade, what she finds is that actually the two may be interacting, and that things basically are more complex than they were assumed to be for some time. And so, yes, a lot of the discussion is actually exactly about disentangling and trying to find out what is the role of trade. And maybe we're somewhat weak on the side of globalization. Is obviously not only trade, it's trade, it's migration, it's mobility of capital, and there we really have a focus on trade. But that would be more of a problem. I think quite a few of the authors actually focus on trade without necessarily having the time or the scope to look at those other dimensions of globalization.
We're running a little short of time, but I will take the two quick questions or comments before we get on to the individual chapters.
Charles Chung from Korea International Trade Association. For the income inequality, I know that the skill upgrading and the education might be good prescription at the micro level, but at the macro level, I don't know how that might play in the solving that problem. For example, in Korea, about 80% of the high school graduates go to colleges. And now we have a big problem with the unemployment for those young people who graduated from the college. Now, if we suppose that the almost all the countries actually go for the education, more education providing and skill upgrading, are we going to find the appropriate people for the appropriate jobs? So there should be some kind of the coordination and the combination of the policies, in addition to just the education and the skill upgrade.
I think it's one of what I would consider an innovative part of this book, that we have a separate chapter on globalization and education. And trade analysis typically consider skills something that is there or not there. We don't look at how you can create skills necessary for functioning well in a globalized world. We organized at the ILO in end of June academic conference also on globalization and labor markets. We brought academics and policymakers together, and one of the conclusions was that more work is needed from the analytical side on how you set up your education systems in order to respond positively to the challenges of globalization. I think in the chapter by Wisman you will find interesting hints, but I think that not full answers. At the ILO we are also in our policy work working directly with governments, enterprises and education institutions in order to get this kind of coordination going that you mentioned, to get decisions at different levels, at the investment level, at the trade policy level and at the education level that lead to a positive match in at the skill and the skill side, to create the kind of skills that are indeed in demand.